What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week on Not Your Average Meta, the crew decided to have a mono blue off. Robert's returning to the table and bringing his Azami Lady of Scrolls deck. This is a wizard tribal deck where he looks to take advantage of all his wizards, tapping and drawing him cards until he can find a win con. Alex is also back this week, playing his newly made Memnarch deck. This deck looks to use artifacts to create a ton of mana in order to use Memnarch's ability and steal all of his opponent's stuff, and yes, that includes their lands. Fog Raw is playing one of his favorite decks, Tromokratis. This deck looks to tap down his opponent's creatures one at a time to take multiple extra turns and knock his opponents out with commander damage. Last but not least, we have Justin, and he's playing Talrand, Sky Summoner. This deck looks to stop his opponents in the tracks by countering spells and bouncing the creatures, all while creating Drake tokens, so he can swing in for victory. Now let's enter the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Justin starts the game by playing an island and passing. Robert draws for turn, plays an island, passes to Alex, who draws for turn, plays an island, taps one and casts a Shadow Spear, and then passes to Fog. He plays a snow-covered island, then passes to Justin. Justin plays another island and passes. Robert draws, plays another island, and then he uses that to tap two and cast a Sapphire Medallion. Alex draws for turn, plays another island and passes. Fog draws for turn, taps two snow islands, and casts a Fellwar Stone and passes to Justin. Justin draws for turn, and this time he plays an Ash Barrens, then he taps three and casts Quiet Contemplation and passes to Robert. Robert draws for turn, plays an island, taps one and plays a Stony Brook Banneret, and then taps another one and plays an Information Dealer, both discounted from the Sapphire Medallion. Alex then draws for turn, plays an island, and passes. Fog untaps, draws for turn, plays Manama, School of Water's Edge, and then taps four to cast a Tidal Barracuda, and passes to Justin. At the beginning of Justin's turn, he untaps all of his lands, draws for turn, plays another island, then taps four to cast his commander, Talrand, Sky Summoner. He then passes the turn to Robert. Robert draws for turn, plays another island, taps three, and tries to cast his commander, Azami Lady of Scrolls, before it's mana drained by Alex, giving Alex 5 colorless mana. In response, Robert taps one and he brainstorms before passing the turn. Alex untaps, plays an island, uses his 5 colorless mana in 2 islands to cast Agent of Treachery and steals the Sapphire Medallion from Robert. Using the discount from Sapphire Medallion and paying 2 life, he taps 2 other islands and casts Phyrexian Metamorph. And this time decides to steal my Tidal Barracuda. He then makes sure all of his cards are organized before passing the turn to Fog. Fog untaps permanents, draws for turn, then takes 3 life to cast the land half of Seagate Restoration before tapping out and casting Wandering Archeoch and passing the turn to Justin. Justin untaps his lands for turn, draws, and then taps 1 island, and he casts Stern Dismissal, bouncing the Tidal Barracuda back to my hand. He then creates a Drake off Talrand's ability and passes the turn to Robert. Robert untaps for turn, draws, taps 3 islands, and he casts a Surge Spanner, and then passes the turn to Alex, who untaps for turn, draws, plays a Reliquary Tower, then Alex taps 3, and he casts Tribute Mage, tuning his library for an artifact. He looks through his library and gets an Ethereum Sculptor, which goes to his hand, before he taps 1 and he casts it. He then passes the turn to Fog. Fog untaps for turn, draws, then taps out to cast a Guardian of Tazim, and then passes the turn to Justin. Justin starts his turn by untapping his island, drawing for turn, and then passing to Robert. Robert responds to the end of his turn by tapping his Information Dealer to look at the top 3 cards of his library and put it back in any order. Afterwards, he untaps his islands, untaps Information Dealer, draws for turn, plays a Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, taps that along with 2 other islands to activate its ability, and taps 2 more islands to recast his commander, Azami, Lady of Scrolls, for the second time. He then passes to Alex. Alex untaps all of his permanents, draws for turn, plays another island, and taps 2 mana and cast Midnight Clock. Recast a Shadow Spear, which he then equips to his Phyrexian Metamorph and goes to combat. He swings to 3 at Justin, who decides not to block, taking the 3 damage, going down to 37, while Alex goes to 41, then he passes the turn to Fog. Fog untaps his permanents and draws, plays another snow-covered island, and then just taps 4 to recast his Tidal Barracuda before passing to Justin. Justin starts his turn by drawing a card, looking at his hand, then tapping 1 and casting Index, but does not pay the extra 2, allowing Fog to copy it with his Wandering Archeoc trigger. So we both look at the top cards of our library, while Robert taps 2 wizards and draws 2 cards, before tapping his Information Dealer and looking at the top 4 cards of his library and putting them back in any order. He then goes to his turn after Justin makes a Drake token, and he casts a Riptide Laboratory, before he taps 3 and he casts Dose of Perfection, which is countered by Alex with an Essence Scatter. After Alex counters his Dose of Perfection, Alex taps 2 and puts a counter on his Midnight Clock, while Robert taps one of his wizards to draw a card. After which he bounces his Sapphire Medallion back to his hand, recasting it. He then passes his turn to Alex. Alex untaps for turn, putting another counter on his Midnight Clock, draws for turn, then goes to combat and swings the Phyrexian Metamorph at Robert this time. Robert takes a hit for 3, going to 37, while Alex gains 3, going to 44. He then taps 3 islands, and he casts Marauding Besieged. After playing Marauding Besieged, he passes the Fog, draws for turn, plays another snow-covered island, and then taps out in order to cast his commander, Tromokratis. Justin starts off his turn by untapping his island, drawing for turn, playing another island, then passing to Robert. Before Robert's turn, he decides to tap his Information Dealer, look at the top 4 cards of his library, and put them back in any order. He then untaps his permanents, draws for turn, plays an Academy Ruins, then taps 1 island to cast a Siren Stormcaller. He then uses the Surge Banner to bounce the Midnight Clock back to Alex's hand, and then he passes the turn. Alex draws for turn, then taps out, and he casts a Meteor Golem, targeting Surge Banner before it's countered with an Essence Scatter by Justin. Alex then takes out all of his aggression, swinging 8 at Robert. Robert takes a hit, going to 29, where Alex gains 3 life, going to 47. At the beginning of Fog's turn, he untaps all of his lands, draws for turn, taps 1 snow-covered island, casts Personal Tutor, and searches his library for Temporal Manipulation and puts it on top of his library. He then decides to swing Tromokratis at Justin, taking him down to 29 and giving him 8 commander damage, before tapping 1 and his Manamo to untap his Tromokratis and passes his turn. At the beginning of Justin's turn, he untaps his island, untaps his commander, then he draws for turn. Then he passes to Robert. Robert decides to tap his Information Dealer, look at the top 5 cards of his library, put them back in any order. He then taps 3 of his 5 wizards, so he can draw 3 cards. Then goes to his upkeep, untapping all of his permanents, and drawing for turn. He then plays the Castle Vantress as his land for turn. Then taps his Nykthos. He then counts up all the blue mana he's about to get. He uses 3 of it to cast a Trophy Mage, going to 2 different extra planar lands, which he then uses 3 more to cast, exiling an island. Then he passes. Alex draws for turn. Plays an island, and after being disappointed he hasn't drawn more artifacts, he taps 3 and casts a Windfall. In response to this, Justin taps enough lands in order to cast a Devastation Tide so we can bounce all of our permanents back to our hands. 2 of the 4 players at the table are not happy about this, so Robert decides to respond to the Tide by casting a Vincer in order to bounce it back to Justin's hand. In response to Vincer, Justin casts Rewind to try to counter it, while I use my Wandering Archeoc to make a copy of Rewind to counter Justin's Rewind, and in response to that, Robert uses his Surge Spanner to bounce his Vincer back to his hand and recast it in order to bounce Alex's Agent of Treachery to his hand, and then the stack resolves, and Windfall ultimately resolves, and we discard our hands and we all draw 7 cards. After which, Alex plays a Sky Diamond, plays a Mystic Forge, plays a Merchant's Dockhand, and then passes his turn to Fog after discarding. At the beginning of his turn, Fog draws a card. He plays a Snow-Covered Island, and off his Tazim trigger, he taps down Alex's Phyrexian Metamorph. He then taps 3, and he casts a Glacial Grasp, and he targets Justin's Talrand, and he draws a card, then swings Tromokratis at Alex for 8. Alex can't block, so he takes a hit, going down to 39 and having 8 commander damage. Then, second main, Fog casts Temporal Manipulation, taking an extra turn. At the beginning of his next turn, he draws, plays a Snow-Covered Island for turn, then he taps 5 Snow-Covered Islands, then he remembers his Guardian of Tazim trigger, so he taps down Robert's Trophy Mage before casting a Graven Lore, scrying 5 and drawing 3 cards. After which, he swings Tromokratis over at Robert, taking Robert down to 21 life, giving him 8 commander damage. Then he delves 6 cards from his graveyard, and then taps 2 more islands in order to cast Dig Through Time, looking at his top 7 cards, putting 2 into his hand and bottoming the rest. After that, he taps a Fellwar Stone and he casts a Mystical Tutor. Fog declares he's going to go look for a Time Warp, putting on top of his library, and he passes his turn to Justin. Justin untaps for turn and goes to untap his commander before he realizes he doesn't untap until his next turn, since he got tapped down from the Glacial Grasp. So he retaps his commander, and then he draws for turn. He then plays an island and passes his turn. At the beginning of Robert's turn, he untaps for turn. Then before his draw step, he flashes in a Mind Over Matter. Then he draws his card for turn. Taps Nykthos to create a lot of blue mana. Then casts a Fate Spinner. And then casts Psychosis Crawler. Then demonstrates a loop of discarding and untapping cards so he can draw his entire deck and win the game. At that point, the rest of the table concedes and Robert wins. Today's big winner was Robert and his Azami Lady of Scrolls deck. Even though he started out the game being extremely land flooded, he still managed to tap those wizards enough to draw through his deck and get to his win con. The MVP card of today's game is Mind Over Matter. Generally, whenever we play Robert and his Azami deck, when he gets to Mind Over Matter, the game is pretty much over at that point. Knowing this, we probably should have taken him out first, but you know how Magic is. Thanks for watching and be on the lookout for more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.